Hey guys, we're here today to sitting down with our friends Doug and Jesse Brown and talk to them a little bit about their story and about their heart and their mission and what they're doing with their organization, Uniquely Knitted.
Thank you so much for having us. It was such an honor to be able to be here and have this conversation.
Tell us a little bit about your story, your journey together, and how Uniquely Knitted, kind of where it came from, how it was birthed.
Yeah.
In 2013, I believe, we went to New York City and we did the classic, like, we're going to get off birth control and try to have babies. And we tried for a year with no prevail. And I just had this sinking feeling that something was wrong. And so then in turn went to the doctor and found out that we both have major issues. And the only way we had a less than 1% chance that we would get pregnant on our own naturally. And then so we pursued 2 fertility treatments and they both failed. And so that was really, really hard for Doug and I.
In the beginning, we were so naive. You know, we were young. We were like, let's go to New York City, and we'll get pregnant, and then we'll have 4 kids. But like the letdown of like 6. How many months went by before we were like, oh no, something's seriously wrong? It's like nine months or something, and we were like, wow, this seems like it's really difficult. And how come I thought as soon as you started to try to have kids, you would just get pregnant, and it just did not turn out like that at all.
So when we first went to the doctor, Doug's scans actually scanned at 0, that he had like
zero chance of
getting pregnant. And then we realized, so that was like 4 days of absolute misery of just like, oh my gosh. I remember sitting in the doctor's office watching the doctor, and that was the first time I ever felt fainting symptoms of like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna faint. Like, because the doctor basically said, this test shows me that you will never be able to have biological children. Later, 4 days later, we found out that the test was actually faulty and it was an admin error. So we were like, okay. So then we got Doug tested more and there was some issues. So that was just a roller coaster of like, okay, we can't have biological children. Okay, maybe we can't. And now we can't again, and we have really bad. And then I have something called low ovarian reserve, which basically means my eggs are old. And so us as a combo package is not a very high chance of having children. So we did 1 IUI treatment and 1 IVF treatment. And the end of IVF, I don't know if anyone knows this, but IVF is very expensive. So it can be anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 to $25,000. And so by the end of our $25,000 in the pot, we only had 1 egg at the end of it, where sometimes people have like 25 to 30 eggs to choose from. That would be really high, but that's typically what it is, around that number. And so we only had 1. And so we had the 1 implanted, and then it didn't take. And so that was excruciating to feel like not only are we so emotionally invested, but we are financially invested. Our friends did a sweet fundraiser and raised our $25,000 for us. So we were like, so it almost felt weird, like, even though they did not make us feel that way at all, but almost felt like we were letting them down in a way because they were helping us. And we were so lucky because not everyone has that kind of, people that had surrounded them. But that's why I think it's so important to talk and share about your story of struggling with infertility, because we shared and we're so blessed. Not that everyone would give you $25,000, but it was really cool to see that. But that was kind of also difficult part of it, was we just almost felt like we were disappointing them too. We were disappointed in ourselves and then disappointing our community. So
that sounds like that was heartbreaking, but not just once. You didn't experience heartbreak one time, you experienced heartbreak over and over again. And what was that like, just having people around you in that season? Were people aware of what was happening?
Yeah, I think that was the thing that was most shocking for us, is that, for me personally, growing up, I had never thought about infertility ever. I just assumed as soon as you started to try, you would get pregnant. And it came out of left field for me and was so shocking. And then kind of on top of that, I was shocked that nobody really talked about it a lot. And when I brought it up, it was an uncomfortable thing to talk about. And we felt like...
Especially for a guy.
Yeah, especially for me. And it felt like if I don't talk about this, I'm just going to get more and more isolated, because the more and more that we struggle as a couple to get pregnant, we're also struggling emotionally. But I feel uncomfortable to talk about it. So my circle, gets smaller and smaller. And then we kind of collectively realized we have to advocate for ourselves in this and talk about infertility, because people aren't talking about it. It's still very taboo. And when you bring it up, there are, people sometimes do say things that they are trying to be comforting, but can come across insensitive at times, because it's just not talked about a ton. And we were really shocked by the amount that it's not talked about on a bigger stage. So that in a lot of ways led us to what we're doing now, which is really exciting for us. But it was incredibly heartbreaking in the beginning, just feeling so alone.
I had to make a choice. Am I going to seek after my community for help, or am I not?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't easy, even though I am a very open book. It still wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to share. But once I did, I felt such relief, because I felt like I was like holding this thing, this like secret that I was, because I really wanted them to be surprised when we told them. And that's what I feel like a lot of people don't share, is because they want that I'm pregnant feeling. Oh my gosh, I didn't even know.
Yeah.
So, and that's what I wanted. And so that was one of the reasons that I kept it to myself. And then one day I just couldn't handle it anymore, and I just started sharing. And it was such an amazing response, because I was fully honest about what was going on, instead of trickle-truthing and just being like, oh yeah, it's something we kind of struggle with a little bit. If you say something kind of like that, sometimes that can bring on, responses like, oh, just relax, or oh, just adopt, or oh, those kind of comments that can be really hurtful. And I feel like sometimes if you really share and open up and are honest with what's going on, people can sometimes have a better response.
Yeah, we noticed that the amount that we shared was the amount that we were cared for as a couple. Like if we just shared a little bit, we only got a little bit of care in return. Like if someone said, "Are you guys struggling?" Be like, "Yeah, it's not too bad." They'd be like, "Oh, okay, that's sorry about that."
Just relax.
And it'd be like, "I know it hurt." And like, "Why don't you care more?" And then we started to realize, well, we need to share more about what's going on. So once we really started to say, "Hey, we're heartbroken, and this is expensive, and we feel like our lives are changing," we started to get more of a response in return, which was powerful.
And people sometimes when they're struggling feel like it's unfair that they have to educate people. I'm already struggling and in this dark place. Now I have to educate people on what I need, but it's like, yes, or you're going to stay in isolation, if nobody knows what's going on.
Right. What are some of those comments that people have made to you that really was well-intending, but really cut deep in a way of like, you don't actually understand what's happening?
I think the one for me would be, once we started to think about adoption, people would always say, as soon as you sign the adoption paperwork, you're going to get pregnant. And it felt completely dismissive of the medical aspect of our diagnosis, of both struggling with medically diagnosable infertility. It felt like all of that could just be washed away by kind of like a wives' tale of like, well, as soon as you sign the adoption paperwork, it felt like, what, then we'll be like magically cured when we do that? So that felt, it seemed innocent, but that one really hurt.
I think any comment that is just, starts with just, you should just stop. Don't say that. You know what I mean? Just do this, because I guarantee that person that is struggling has been thinking about it so long to talk to you about, and they have tried all those justs. You know what I mean? All those just adopt, just have some wine, just whatever, just relax. And then when you kind of say those just comments, it puts it on that person like they're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
I still get just adopt another child and you'll get pregnant. I still get that.
Yeah.
And I'm just so much more forthcoming now to be like, nope.
That's not how it works.
Not for us. False. Yeah, exactly.
Right,
false. So, and I think too, a very well-intentioned thing is when someone says that I still get to, like, people are still praying for Doug and I to get pregnant, which is very, very, very sweet and very, very good intentioned. But I think I'd rather them say, what was that like? Not being able to have kids, or you know what I mean? That is where you can meet me, instead of, because I feel like Doug and I have really done a good job at grieving what happened to us, and really feel like we have moved on from that. So it feels like it's missing me a little bit. Like, oh, I'm still praying for you to have kids. It's like, okay, not that I want to be like, please don't, but I feel so on the other side of it that it doesn't feel like it's meeting me in that way.
It feels like I still view you as broken, first of all. Like, you're broken and you should have children, and I'm praying for that still. But where we're at now is a blessing and is wonderful. So it's a complicated thing.
Yeah.
So taking a note and learning, I'm learning as I'm listening to you. What was that like for you to not be able to have children?
It was excruciating. I had a name that, getting emotional, but I had a name of actually Ruby, my grandma that went to Eastside. Since I was 11 years old, I wanted to name my daughter, let it crack. I wanted to name my daughter Ruby after her. So I took about a year in therapy to really dive through that really dive through that. And my therapist was really good at picking apart every aspect of having a biological child and me focusing my grief on that. So it would be like, let's think about you never being able to breastfeed a child. And just think about that for a while. And I'm like, okay, and it sounds terrible, but I really think that was really helpful for me to move on, is I really thought about it, and I thought about, I really thought that was going to be my path, and it's not. Or let's think about that you will never have a birth story or something like that. Or you will never show up to a shower pregnant. Or you might not be able to ever surprise your family with, I'm pregnant. So I think it was so devastating for me, and that name was really helpful. Me naming it was really helpful for me to channel my grief and to use that to kind of heal, I would say.
Process.
Yeah, process that. So I took a year. It took
Yeah.
a year for me to do that.
Yeah.
What would you say, Doug?
For me, I would say it was life-changing. And I had a vision for my life and what it would look like and what our family would look like. And this single event changed the future of what I thought was going to be. And I think that I keep coming back to that over and over and over again, is that so much of who I am now is because of that season I went through. And it transformed me. The pain, the grief, the whole process that we went through transformed me into who I am now. And I never in a million years would have thought that we would be here doing what we're doing now. But unless I had dived into that pain, I don't think I would have actually gotten there, as it felt so painful. It felt so painful. It wasn't that I was having to grieve my life in the way that I thought it was. It was like I was grieving my life even prior, because I had set my life up to live in a certain way and have a certain feel to my life and my family. And even I had to even grieve that. Like all of that wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And it was a absolutely, totally like giving up of everything that I thought, all the control that I thought I had. I'm more of I like to be in control and like organize things, and it was like I just had to let go of absolutely everything, and just live with my hands like totally wide open, which I'm sure we'll talk about when we moved into adoption and foster care. It was like, okay, well, maybe we can control this, and it's like, no way, you can't control that either.
That's more of a
totally
uncontrolling situation.
So now, as foster parents, it feels like we're conditioned to be loving. And live our life the way that we know we can live our life, but to do it without holding on to control, which is which has been a journey. But it started day one when we were struggling to grow our family. I was like, how come this is so difficult? It was the beginning of having to let go of control.
I think one thing I will add that Doug and I have had a plus in one way, which I think people in the infertility community don't. We had a really bad diagnosis. So I think that was helpful to be like, okay, this door seems like it's shutting. You know what I mean? Like, let's move on to something else. And a lot of people in the infertility world have undiagnosed infertility, so they just keep going and treading. And so I think that's also was helpful for me in my grief, was it really felt like that door was shut and we were moving on to something else, and I had to grieve it to be able to move on to adoption.
When you think about being in that journey and even processing that diagnosis and, like you're saying, grieving the past, grieving the future, like which am I grieving, all of it?
Yeah.
What was your relationship with God, viewpoint of God, anger at God? Like what was that like in that process?
I was very confused. Doug and I feel like would be great parents. A lot of the times I would go to Disneyland during these times because we had Disneyland passes. And if you want to go and see the most parenting highs and the parenting lows, just go to Disneyland. And there was so many times where I would sit there and I would observe situations with parents, and they're exhausted. I get it. I'm there now. Like,
We've been there now.
We've been there now. I get it. But it's like kind of sometimes you see the worst of people there, especially when they're parenting. And so I would go home from Disneyland and just cry all the way home of like, why I would not treat them that way. Like, you know, Doug and I would be such great parents. And so God, why don't you want that for us? I remember saying that all the time. Why does God not want something good for us? Why not? And I remember in that time, especially around like taking pregnancy tests and having them go negative all the time, month after month, I remember actually physically picturing God in a corner, and I almost like was like, I'm not ready for you yet. That's how I felt. Like I was okay with receiving comfort from Doug, but I was almost too scared of what was going to happen if I fully let him in. That I remember. Do you remember me telling you? I'd be like,
totally.
I feel like God's over there in the corner. He's not necessarily, even though he was there with us, but I feel like I was kind of keeping him over there, like, I'll get to you. And in therapy, that's when I was like, oh, maybe I need to start dealing with that too.
So during this time when we were going through infertility, I was actually a pastor. And I remember thinking, I wonder if people think that this is a God thing, you know? And that always bothered me for some reason. Was I thought, because people would say, oh, I'm praying for you, I want this for you. And there was like a sense that, did I do something wrong to make God not want this for me? And then on the flip side, I was thinking, God, are you using me in this situation to like do something really miraculous? So I was confused. I actually didn't even know how to approach the situation with God. Obviously, I was incredibly close to the Lord, still am, and in praying, I would bring to God, like, God, whatever this is, like, are you using this situation? Are you trying to teach us through something? And then I think as the years went on, I started to realize that sometimes bad things happen, and sometimes difficult things happen to people, and people can go through tremendous pain, and and there doesn't have to be a giant mystical moment where everything makes sense. I think in hindsight, as I look at it, God used this situation and God grew us through this situation and the grief that we've gone through. And we are now bringing so much hope and light to people. And I thank God for the way that he's grown us. But I'm no longer like searching under the rocks for the thing that God was doing. Because I felt like that was a really hard part for me in the midst of it. People would ask, like, this is like, I'm waiting for the miracle, or God is just setting this up so he can really shine. And then, you're 7 years in and you're like, where's the shine? Yeah. But I think it's even just changing our view of how traumatic and bad things happen to people. People go through horrible things all the time. Disease, accidents, the death of loved ones, the death of children. I mean, horrible things happen and traumatic things happen. And instead of making it trivial and saying, God's going to use this to shine, God always is shining. God is always glorious and always powerful. And we as people grow through these difficult things that we go through. So I was almost dismissive of myself in the beginning, like, oh, God's going to figure this out. But I realize now that God had already figured everything out, and it was me who was growing through the whole process.
What would you say are some of the biggest feelings you felt in that process, and kind of expectations? Yeah,
I would say when we first really realized we're struggling with infertility, growing our family is not the way we thought it was going. We're not going to be able to have biological children. This is going to be a long journey. It's going to require a ton of work. Disappointed is like the least you could say. It was heartbreaking. I had like full on just give up on life feelings. I was like, everything that I've done leading up to this point is a disappointment. Everything that could happen in the future is a disappointment. I was ready to, completely lose everything. I didn't know where to go.
Doug was definitely, when we were in the thick of it, in like carry mode of me. But then also seeing that I was going through so much pain, made him want to run. And made him want to be like, I can't do this. I can't watch you be in pain. I'm in pain. We're not growing our family. This is terrible. I felt hopeless. Yeah. Completely hopeless. That's what I felt. Complete and utter hopelessness. And I feel like it took me in therapy to like really truly grieve, and especially me with an infant thing. I went into adoption being like, okay, I'll let go of not having biological children, but I'm going to hold on to this real tight, and you are not going to take it away from me. I am going to name my adopted child. I am going to have sparkly, adopted, amazing children, and they're going to love me, and, all those things. And so I went in with these preconceived things, and my therapist was like, why does it have to be an infant? And I was like, okay. Because our son came to us at 18 months old, and our daughter came at 8 years old. So we've never had an infant. So, and I remember that being like, she's like, what if he wants something different for you? And he doesn't want that. And I remember that was the first time where I was like, my hope in a weird way felt alive a little bit. Like, oh, what if my path is over here? Like, and that there is hope there. And what if we can help these children that need homes? Like Doug always says to me all the time, like, what are we doing? We're helping children that don't have any place to go. They have nowhere to go. We are helping them instead of we're helping them for us. You know what I mean? And so I think God really in therapy helped me kind of change my hope to really like be okay and be disappointed that my hope was in this, but maybe you have another path. And so hope was a big thing. I still struggle with hope a bit because of that season. I almost have like PTSD of like, don't get your hopes up. I'm like, oh, don't worry, I haven't. But I really have.
You're like,
you know what I mean?
don't worry, I've let them all die.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I totally, and I want to go back. You keep mentioning therapy, and I'm a big advocate for therapy. I go to therapy myself. How has therapy played a role in your processing and healing?
For me, it gave me an avenue where someone wasn't emotionally invested in me. They loved me, she loved me, she did, and she loved me, but I was surrounded by so many people that were so invested in me and so cared, so highly emotional for me that I feel like sometimes the reaction was protective of me. And so I feel like my therapist was able to like cut the crap and be like this. And I was like, okay, yeah. And that was just helpful for me just to have a space that I could just process and be however I wanted to feel. And then her always give her 2 cents at the end and be like, oh my gosh, that was really helpful. Thank you. Like the whole infant thing, like, you know, talking about that. And that was really helpful for me. So it just gave me a place to just really process how I was doing and feeling and get some guidance. You're so lost. You're so, don't know what to do. And I had never been through this before. I feel like I was pretty great at processing my emotions until I got to this. And then I was like, oh, I'm not very good at this because I'm still having a really hard time. So she was able to really help me process those things and just give me a safe space to do that.
I would say for me, when we were going through our struggle to grow our family, there were some, I would say, traumatic moments of finding out things didn't work or the procedural things that you have to go through. There were some moments that stick out as pretty traumatic. And I think those moments, I tried to care for myself in a way that I just thought would work. And it just wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to care for myself in the normal, like, oh, I'll go for a run, like going for a run is great, but it wasn't enough to actually get down to what was really going on. It took, to be perfectly honest, it took a professional help to see the areas where I needed to see the areas where I was affected and to know the ways to grow forward. And there was no shame in that. It wasn't like, oh, I have to go here because I'm broken. It was like, this is big. This is bigger than I ever thought it could be. My life has totally changed. I need someone to guide me. And that's kind of what it felt like, yeah.
And I feel like because of therapy and because of our growth and healing from it, now we can accurately see when we're triggered. Yeah. So we can go through some things with adoption just because it's so kind of intertwined with each other. And there's so many times where I go, Doug, that's my infertility talking, or that's my trigger of my infertility. But I can call that out now instead of lashing out irrationally. I'm not saying I never do that, but lashing out irrationally about something that doesn't really matter when it's like, oh no. And that's where it really helped me to be like, oh, that's my infertility talking, not, that's my trigger from that, or my PTSD kind of from that.
Totally. And I can imagine, 100%. Yeah. And I can imagine, at least myself and my husband, without, we're not at that place in our life yet where we've worked to grow our family, but when each person involved in the, marriage is processing their own stuff happening, you're not trying to rely on the other person that's also experiencing hurt and pain and hopelessness and just devastation. I could imagine that being a hard dynamic, trying to get something from the other person when they're hurting.
And that's why struggling in this way in infertility is so unique. It's this, both people are going through so much and you want to rely on each other, but both people are also struggling. So that's why you need outside guidance, you need a community, and you need friendship to go through that. Going back to what you were saying about the idea of like disappointment, is I feel like for me, I was so crushed by the disappointment, but I think the thing I was crushed with most was that I was crushed that my vision for how my life wasn't turning out. I had written it all in my mind, and this just broke it all. Now we can use what we've gone through and bring into reality a new future that is awesome, and it's really great. And any future that God has for me is really great. But it took grieving it and going through the pain of it to realize that this new future that we're living, this new reality that we're living, can be a wonderful one, and God is in every part of it.
I think for me, Doug was more this picture that he had in his head of how many kids and all that, and mine was really the baby. Like, what was our baby going to look like? What was the actual infant going to look like? What was the future child going to look like?
Yeah.
And so that was really hard for me.